Minaz, so tell me your thoughts on what do you think is the level of awareness most boards have about the enterprise risk management processes that are actually going on within the organization?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In my view, having worked with many boards, large and medium size, I believe the board awareness is sort of, I would say, adequate. Is not at a level that you'd expect it to be at. And the reason is that I don't think the boards are actually know what to look for from an awareness standpoint. They aren't actually sure what actually makes them an organization that follows ERM.
So what should they be doing to become more aware?
I think there are a couple of characteristics of an ERM company that I sort of work with. I first ask the board members if they actually have a risk policy, and ask them some very clear questions in terms of, do you know what a risk policy actually entails? What does it have? And you get very diverse responses to that question. But what I'm looking for actually are sort of some keywords like risk appetite, risk tolerance, that they actually appreciate what risk appetite means. They've actually delved into determination of risk appetite, or they know the methodology of at least somebody having done some work on it. So that's the first characteristic. The second one I asked them is, what do you think your risk culture is in the organization? Do people actually, do they know what they're accountable for? So in other words, for every risk that's in the organization, do they have say a risk sponsor or a risk owner? And how does that actually get cascaded down to the business unit? Does the business unit actually, or the employees of the business unit or the managers actually appreciate what they're managing from a risk perspective? And then the last one, and these three questions actually give me a good idea what's going on. The third one, in terms of the reporting part of it, I actually asked them if they actually, what sort of reporting do they have? What do they get from a board perspective on risk? And what is summarized in it? So what sort of metric is defined? Does the risk reporting actually line up with, from a line of sight perspective, to the company's business strategy and objectives? So those three give me a very clear insight into whether the board are aware of the risk management process or not.
So you mentioned a few different things. Let me start with the risk appetite. I get asked the question a lot, which show me a really good risk appetite. Who has a really good risk appetite statement? And most of us in the field say there aren't many. If you look at most risk appetite statements, they're cobbling together of sort of the mission, vision, the kinds of risk we're in the business of taking. It's information that predates ERM. It's been available somewhere else. Maybe they throw in investment guidelines because they have some numbers, but they don't really have. They haven't because they haven't gone through the process. So you're raising a good point. If you ask that question, that will reveal, first of all, is it there? But then is the board even aware of it? So that's the second thing. You also mentioned, I just want to pick on the risk culture thing. So there's a lot of different definitions of risk culture. I often try to define it as not something that you could write on paper, but more what's actually happening. So to what level ERM is integrated into decision-making and into accountability, into business performance analytics and incentive compensation. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So the way I work the risk culture sort of equation, I sort of define it as sort of values and behaviors that are instilled or are in the company that actually creates an intuitive sort of process whereby all employees or managers or board members or management or whoever actually follow and stick to. So for example, if you have an employee who sort of sees a risk issue or identifies a risk issue, he or she should be able to cascade this issue to the next level without having to think about it. That's the type of risk culture I think about, and it also lends itself to people actually knowing, people who are actually in the company sort of have accountability of the risk that they have. So for example, the way I look at it, they sort of the back room, the middle room, and so the front room. The back room guys are the guys who are actually creating the risk policies, the risk appetite, and defining everything and linking it to the strategy. And then you got the middlemen who actually are the compliance people, people who are actually making sure that whatever has to be done is actually being done. But those are the guys people really don't like to have around. They're usually the auditor, accounting types that nobody wants around. And then you have the front line guys, these are the ones who actually create the risk and manage the risk and do the work themselves. It could be the business unit, it could be wherever. And so each of these individuals know what their responsibility is, what they're accountable for, how they're going to get measured on. And for a very effective risk culture, you would actually reward good risk behavior and sanction poor risk behavior.
So you talked about a lot of elements of the risk governance. You talked about the boards and their lack of awareness in many cases of what's actually going on. You've talked about executive risk owners and the connectivity down to the businesses and individuals of risk policies. These are some of the different aspects of it, and of course, you mentioned different parts of the risk culture. Would you say there's a wide range of behaviors in all sectors? Do you see any sectors doing this better than others?
I'm from the energy world. I'm in Calgary, and I deal with non-financial corporates. The companies that do a really good job are companies that have commodity traders, and they do a lot of the hedging programs. They actually have a good basis to actually measure ERM. They don't necessarily call it ERM. They would call risk management processes, and they actually, because there have been a lot of cases globally where the traders or the hedgers have actually created a lot of risk from an operational perspective, you see a lot of these organizations starting to actually dwell into this stuff and actually put good processes in place.
OSFI is required for banks and insurance companies in Canada, effective this year, 2014. A lot of criteria regarding having robust ERM, and part of that is that the boards have to really be aware, not a subset of the board, but the full board has to really be aware of what's going on with the ERM program, that the risk appetite is actually aligned with the decision making. So if you were to put a grade on the energy sector in terms of how much they would be aligned with that, where do you think, or what's the range of where companies are?
So if I was to divide this, I would sort of call it the group that is actually needs to do risk management, which is sort of the trader, commodity type energy guys, or the mining sector. I would put them as sort of a B minus. And then if I was to think about it as excluding them, but having energy companies, they're probably in the C.
C, a little bit worse. So an opportunity for improvement.
There's a lot of improvement opportunities. The reason is that there aren't regulations to actually force them to do anything at all. What's happening in the business practice, in the consulting world, as we educate the boards and actually show them that there's actually value, and you show them empirical evidence and source and evidence from papers and stuff that's out there available, that ERM actually adds value, then they start appreciating it. They still have this tendency of thinking that risk management is purely to minimize losses, and we need to sort of educate them that minimizing losses doesn't necessarily add value to the organization. You need to sort of optimize the risk and start discussing what I call the cost of risk type approach. In terms of what I mean is that you need to understand if for any business you have costs of doing business, and the business could be if you put a safety program in place, or whether you decide to insure your risk, or you decide to share your risk or outsource your risk to somebody else. All these are costly items. And as long as you work out your risk programs and make sure that your expected losses, and your cost of risk are equating to themselves, then you're okay. But you could be spending a lot of money on risk management, but that doesn't mean you're optimizing your risk, because at a certain point, you can throw so much money at this, but there's a marginal cost of return there. And so that's the education part that...
I'm glad you raised that, because a lot of boards of management are pushing back on, I would say, quote unquote ERM, because one of the ERM is growing and it's big, and people often ask me, well, is there anything that could get in its way of growing? And I say, well, yes, because it became so hot so quick. Everybody and their brother and sister put a hat on and drew the letter E in front of their RM. They may have been risk management. There's nothing wrong with that. They didn't really understand ERM, or maybe they were trying to spin their traditional risk management services into an ERM offering. It's poisoned the phrase. A lot of doors are being knocked on and wares are being shown to boards of management that are decades old. They're not really new, and they're not adding value, and they're more downside focused. So there is legitimate pushback on a downside focused only approach. But you and I look at ERM defined, I think, the correct way, which is it's a quantum leap ahead, which looks at risk and return volatility, upside and downside together, presents risk reward information, says what are we doing? Is this a good business decision? As you mentioned, you can use ERM to rationalize to actually prove that you have the correct amount of risk mitigation in place, or maybe you need more or less, both. And can we take more risk in the business? And I've had multiple clients that want to use this to say, we didn't know how much more risk we could take. Now we know. We can be a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, it's one of my mentors years ago raised an interesting sort of example and said, okay, what makes a car go faster? And then he gave me sort of A, B, C, D, E, and A was like brakes, B was obviously the gas pedal, and there are a few other variations, and I obviously intuitively say, obviously it's the gas pedal, like you push the gas pedal and the car goes faster. And he says, actually no, it's the brakes, because once you know what your limitations are and you know your brakes work, you can go around those race cars pretty fast and press the gas pedal, but you need to have the brakes to make sure that you're safely stopping if you need to, right?
Yeah, I love that story. It was another analogy I heard years ago. It was pretty good. If you look, and I don't remember the statistics, but when people first started climbing, what's the tallest mountain? I forgot the name of it. Everest, right? Everest. When people first started climbing Everest, a lot of people died.
Yeah.
And now it's like an excursion. So many people are climbing it. It's ridiculous, and the risk hasn't really changed. It's our ability to manage that has changed, so we're able to climb higher and farther. So it's kind of an analogy to the business that you're bringing up. So we've shared a lot of good thoughts you shared with us about boards, and there's a way to go, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at the risk governance structure, and that there's a difference between ERM and downside risk mitigation. So I think you've given our audience a lot to think about. So thank you.
Thanks.